Canadian home prices have increased by 553% over the last 25 years. That is a greater amount than any other G20 nation in the world. In fact, the growth in Canadian home prices dwarfs any G7 nation as well. And with interest rates increasing to levels not seen since before 2007, housing affordability in Canada is disappearing quickly. But the real question is, how did Canadian housing get so unaffordable, especially when home prices were so comparable to American housing prices for so long? Well, the answer to that question is multifaceted, and I'm going to show you exactly why in this video. But before we get into it, my name's Nolan Matthias, and if you want to thrive financially, this is the place for you. So go ahead and click that subscribe button and hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. Alright, so let's get into the discussion about why Canadian real estate has gotten so ridiculously expensive, especially in comparison to our American counterparts. And while the answer to this question is complicated, I'm going to try to simplify it. And it all begins with the financial crisis in 2008. Because for at least 15 years prior to that, Canadian real estate and American real estate was fairly similarly priced. But in 2008, something happened that caused Canadian real estate to rise while American prices fell. And that, of course, was the global financial crisis. And to really understand this first piece of what happened, we have to begin by talking about the significant differences in the banking and mortgage systems between the two countries. Because what saved Canadian real estate, Canadian banks, and the mortgage system in general in Canada from the collapse that was felt in the US was the more prudent banking standards that were in place in Canada. And to be more precise, it probably wasn't the more stringent rules around mortgages in Canada that saved the Canadian real estate market, because at the time, Canada's mortgage market was heading towards more American-style lending. But it was probably the fact that we never quite got to the point where the American system got, which was the famous ninja loans. The no income, no jobs, no assets, the ability for Americans to buy houses essentially without qualifying en masse. In fact, what primarily caused the financial crisis in 2008 was the overzealous lending on mortgages in the US. Now, this led to an interesting phenomenon. As global interest rates dropped due to the financial crisis, Canada's real estate market didn't face the same headwinds that the US market did. In the US, people who were unable to afford their homes were going into foreclosure and having to sell properties at fire sale prices. However, in Canada, because we had not gotten to the point where we were doing ninja loans yet, most people had still qualified for their mortgages and were able to continue to afford them. And due to a whole bunch of other factors that kept the Canadian economy stable, what this led to was a boom in real estate caused by lower interest rates, even though the Canadian economy wasn't necessarily in need of those lower interest rates at the time. Which meant that Canadians could borrow more money for cheaper, which led to rising real estate prices. And while demand for housing in the US dropped to all-time lows, Canadian housing continued to have the same levels of demand, albeit at significantly cheaper borrowing rates. And as a result of less job losses in the Canadian economy, Canadian real estate skyrocketed relative to disposable income. And this was largely due to the fact that we did not have the same levels of demand destruction that happened in the US from the collapse of many of their major banks. And while it's clear that the collapse of the financial markets in the US created more affordability in their real estate markets, in Canada it did the opposite. Now, even with interest rates low after the financial crisis, the federal government in Canada did their best to slow housing by reducing available amortizations from 40 years down to 25 years, removing the ability to have 0% down payment mortgages and 100% financing, and implementing the stress test. But even these moves designed to slow down housing price growth didn't have an effect on the overall real estate prices in Canada. However, it wasn't just a story of lower interest rates alone. In addition to lower interest rates, Canada's real estate problem was compounded by greater growth in population than any other G7 nation. And this shouldn't be surprising, especially considering that Canada has ranked at least 4 cities in the top 10 most livable cities in the world consistently for the last 10 to 15 years. But along with higher population growth, came a decline in the number of private dwellings per 1,000 people relative to other G7 countries. In fact, Canada's dwellings per 1,000 people is well below the G7 average. And this is quite simply because housing construction in Canada since the 1980s has failed to keep up to population growth. Now, there are many reasons for this, but the primary reason is the not in my backyard philosophies held by many local governments, where votes are often dependent on housing, and one bad move for a local politician can be catastrophic to their political careers, which has led to a significant amount of bureaucratic roadblocks to higher levels of housing. And while provincial and federal governments do their best to try to increase housing levels, it comes down to permitting and whether or not local governments will allow houses to be built at higher density in their local communities. And until local municipal governments figure out how to create a greater housing supply while not straining resources, we're going to have significant issues with respect to housing in Canada. Combine this with rising costs for building, higher interest rates, and declining housing values, and it's making construction less affordable for builders and developers, and less likely to happen in the near future, which could mean that housing prices will continue to increase even after we see a small correction in the Canadian real estate market. But all is not lost in Canadian real estate. While two of our biggest cities are among the most unaffordable in North America, we still have a significant amount of cities that are among the most affordable as well, with Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Quebec City among those. All amazing places to live where you can still buy a house for a reasonable price. However, the housing risk indicators cannot be ignored. And it seems there's only one solution to higher real estate prices in Canada. And that is either for Canada to increase the housing supply available for Canadians or to slow population growth. And more than likely, the solution is a combination of the two. And until such time as population growth slows or housing supply increases substantially, we're probably going to see continued high prices in our major cities, similar to what we've seen in other major international cities like New York, London, and Hong Kong.